Welcome. My name is Meredith Toohey, and I'm the Director of Programmatic Operations at the American Nutrition Association, the ANA. 2022 is the year of nutrition for mental health at the ANA. This webinar features ANA's Manager of Nutrition Science, Victoria Yunez Behm, and ANA's scientific advisors and 2022 Summit co-chairs, Ahmed, El-Sohemy, and Derrick MacFabe, for a lively conversation drawing links between nutrigenomics and microbiome as leading areas of research at the intersection of personalized nutrition and mental health. Victoria is a certified nutrition specialist with a master's degree in nutrition and integrative health from Maryland University of Integrative Health, where she teaches culinary nutrition and life cycle nutrition. Dr. Ahmed El-Sohemy is a professor and held a Canada Research Chair in nutrigenomics at the University of Toronto. He is the founder of Nutrigenomics, Inc., and serves as the President and Chief Science Officer. He obtained his PhD from the University of Toronto and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. Dr. El-Sohemy has published in the top scientific and medical journals with more than 180 peer-reviewed publications and has given more than 250 invited talks around the world. He's on the editorial board of 10 journals and has served as an expert reviewer for more than 30 different scientific and medical journals and 12 research granting agencies. Dr. El-Sohemy has received a number of awards for excellence in research by the Canadian Nutrition Society and the American Nutrition Association. Dr. Derrick MacFabe is the director of the Khalil Patchell Evans Autism Research Group in London, Ontario, Canada, an international research consortium originally founded in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at the Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. He is a core member of the I Target Autism Initiative at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. Dr. Derrick MacFabe is currently a visiting professor, Department of Microbiology, Faculty of Medicine at the Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Dr. MacFabe's research examining the role of short-chain fatty acids as possible nutritional, gastrointestinal, metabolic, immunological, and microbiome links in autism has been listed among the top 50 scientific discoveries in Canada by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. He has served on numerous committees and is the recent co-editor of the journal Children and Health Frontiers in Public Health. Welcome, Victoria, Derrick, and Ahmed.
Okay. Ahmed and Derrick, thank you both so much for joining me today. And thank you to all of our viewers. 2022 is ANA's Year of Nutrition for Mental Health. And we wanted to kick off May, which is National Mental Health Awareness Month, with this conversation with two of ANA's scientific advisors who are also scientific co-chairs of this year's Summit, Personalized Nutrition 2022. We're so grateful to both of you for helping to craft this year's event. And of course, we've had many thought-provoking conversations leading up to this point about personalized nutrition and nutrigenomics and the nutrition, gut microbiome, brain interactions. And these areas of inquiry are crucial pieces of the puzzle for understanding how our cognition and mental well-being are intricately connected with our nutritional status. A little background for our viewers before we get into the interview portion. Mental health, neurological, and substance use disorders are some of the top contributors to the global burden of disease, to disability and reduced quality of living. Conditions like depression, anxiety, and disordered eating have been associated with an increased risk of leading causes of death like cardiovascular disease. And the COVID-19 pandemic and other tragedies around the world these last 2 years have really brought conversations about mental health to the forefront and the focus in the public sphere. So we want to highlight that today and throughout our 2022 programming. Google year-in search trends, and I looked at 2021, indicate that how to maintain mental health was searched more in 2021 than ever before. And in nutrition, anxiety, depression, burnout, stress, autism spectrum disorders, and disordered eating top the list of mental health categories. Personalized nutrition is increasingly being recognized as a powerful tool in the prevention and treatment of a wide array of conditions related to mental health and brain function. So again, our programming this year will continue to emphasize these important areas of research and uplift the voices of clinicians, scientists, and change agents who are taking up the banner, like both of you. So I'd like to start by giving you the floor to talk a little bit about your work and your particular interests as they relate to mental health or how your work intersects with the topic. And Ahmed, let's go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Victoria. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to share with you some of our thoughts. And From a research perspective, the work that we've been doing at the University of Toronto, some of my graduate students have been focusing on a very specific aspect of mental health and women's health, which is premenstrual symptoms. These are conditions, both somatic, in other words, physical as well as affective, symptoms that impact the quality of life for millions of women of childbearing age. Approximately 30% of women experience severe symptoms, and about 8 to 10% experience really extreme symptoms that things like suicide and other mental health conditions that we obviously want to try to understand and figure out how can we alleviate those. So we've been looking at both nutrition and genetics, ultimately in terms of actionable recommendations that we hope to be able to provide relate to some of the micronutrients, but individuals metabolize them quite differently. And what's good for one person might not be good for someone else. So really kind of focusing on that particular aspect of mental health. And we hope that that would help shed light on other aspects of mental health. So among the premenstrual symptoms are things like anxiety and depression, of course, along with things like severe changes in mood. And by understanding the mechanism by which some of these micronutrients could improve those conditions in women, perhaps that might help us better understand in other populations how we can use nutrition to improve those conditions.
Yeah, thank you. And your talk at the 2021 conference on the topic was really amazing. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in going back to check out our 2021 video, so you can check out that talk. Derrick, how about you?
Well, my background is in clinical medicine, neurology, but also basic science. And I'm the director of the Keeley-Patch 11's Autism Research Group. It originally started also in Canada at the University of Western Ontario, but now it's expanded internationally. It's a group of multidisciplinary clinicians and researchers that are looking at the real mechanisms linking neurodevelopmental disorders, but also other conditions, and their role between diet, the microbiome, immune system, gene expression, and mental health. So our group's multidisciplinary, animal behavior, human clinical studies, people working in such diverse fields as lipid biochemistry, metabolism, microbiome, large populations, and human migration, because this is another issue, not just changing diet, but also how all these areas go together, again, in specifically genetically sensitive groups. So here we've got Ahmed's beautiful work with, how genomics play a role in terms of mental health. We started a lot with these peculiar linkages with autism that was originally 1 in 10,000 in the 1950s up to like 1 in 35 or 40 now. And this peculiar linkage of gut and GI problems, immune system problems, and, for want of a better word, a rough start early in birth, problems in pregnancy, antibiotics, C-sections, but also very interestingly, the changing diet of, as we'll all agree, not real food, highly processed, refined foods in conjunction. All these compounds together seem to be derailing the normal microbiome, which people didn't talk about this 15, 20 years, but all the technologies that are available in long populations and large groups are showing how when you have a derailment of that system, you have broad changes in brain development, immunity, inflammation that not only affect autism, but all these other neuropsychiatric conditions. Because now the brain is looked at more like with mental health, a brain that's inflamed, a hot brain, or a brain with dysregulated energy and lipids. So it's interesting that our work from families has kind of expanded broadly. So I'm so honored to partner with you folks on looking at this incredibly unappreciated role with real food, which is basically food for these bugs in mental health.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the things you and I have talked about in the past, Derrick, is that idea that the etiology of many of these conditions is very similar. So if there's anything else that either of you would add, how is the research in personalized nutrition right now more broadly helping us learn more about the etiological factors of mental health conditions? And I use that term mental health conditions pretty broadly myself. So what's coming up in terms of sort of that plethora of conditions that might be clustered when we talk about mental health? How is personalized nutrition research in other areas and more broadly helping us understand the etiology and some of the therapeutic interventions? Ahmed, why don't you go ahead and take that one first?
Sure. I mean, as you mentioned, Victoria, we're definitely beginning to understand a lot more now about some of the risk factors and mechanisms that are involved, some pathways that impact things like inflammation and oxidative stress. We're beginning to recognize how exactly they can trigger some of these conditions. And we know, of course, that there are a number of nutrients, food bioactives, micronutrients, even macronutrients that can alter the way these pathways are regulated, which ultimately impacts both the risk and the severity of a number of these conditions. And of course, I have to, mention genetics because we know that one size does not fit all. And so a certain amount for one individual can alter a pathway to a greater extent than someone else at the same dose of a particular micronutrient. So again, I think, when you mention etiology, immediately I start to think of some of those physiological pathways that we can regulate and modulate using certain dietary interventions in a personalized manner based on the individual and their unique biochemistry.
Yeah, thank you. Derrick, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, and actually, those of us that are working in the microbiome field, it certainly isn't an either or. It's really beautiful how we're seeing how this microbiome kind of acts like an orchestrator of brain development and also immune system development, which in turn affects the brain as well as the gut. And there's real mechanisms for figuring this out. So, for example, we concentrated on the bacterial products that bacteria in our gut produce. What these bacteria produce depends what kind of bugs are there, and most importantly, what you feed them. So there are compounds that we've seen called short-chain fatty acids. Now there's thousands of compounds that these gut microbiome products produce since we started, done by other groups. But overlapping with what Ahmed said, these products are not all the same. Dose and timing ratios make a difference, and it depends how much and how when. It's like building a garden, if you will. What kind of these fatty acids produce brain development? So then you have these paradoxes of imbalances causing over growth of brain, which is a paradox we see in autism, or turning on immune cells in the brain, as well as autism and depression and other neurodevelopmental conditions. And as Ahmed mentioned as well, these bacteria products actually fine-tune the mitochondria that actually came from bacteria. So there's a working relationship between mitochondria and producing oxidative stress and a lot of cell signaling. You can appreciate cells that need a lot of energy, like the brain, have profound effects. So things aren't necessarily good or bad. We're really trying to understand what's normal. But again, what Ahmed said as well, you have these genetic conditions where people can't clear these compounds very well, or there's emerging mitochondrial disorders, which we'll talk about later in the meetings, and also how different populations where the microbiome's been damaged by early antibiotics, hospitalizations, or migration. This is a big thing now because of this pandemic or the tragedy of war, where people go from one place to another, how these affect multiple conditions. And the things we saw in autism are paralleled with depression, Parkinson's disease, OCD, eating disorder. And we're also, broadly speaking, have this changing diet actually affecting whole cultures. These are the sentinels of these illnesses, but is the Western diet with high refined carbs and absence of good whole foods, that we'll talk in later, which are bug food, really starting to derail us as a species?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate both of these perspectives in this conversation, because I think sometimes research happens in silos and conversations happen in silos. And to be able to say, we need all of this information, we need all of these evaluations and the research to come together so that we can more fully understand the etiology and effective interventions is really important. So thank you both. And Derrick, you mentioned the pandemic. So I want to shift just a little bit to talking about this remains top of mind, of course, for many of us personally and professionally, whether in nutrition or in the arena of mental health. So I just wanted to ask what lines of inquiry you've both been following when it comes to COVID. How have you seen COVID impacting mental health? And are there any populations you're particularly interested in or concerned about? For example, Derrick, you and I have talked a lot about the impact on children, food insecurity, and many other factors. So let's start with you, Derrick.
Certainly. Yes, this tragedy that's happened may paradoxically be something that can benefit the whole world in terms of preventing this from occurring or understanding how this overlaps mental health and stress. We are looking also at the effects of these viruses. We know other viruses that affect child and brain development. The good news, short-term with studies have shown kids that are born to moms that have had COVID, as opposed to other severe viral infections we know, seem to be developing the same as those that haven't been affected. But this recent study that came out of Colombia, I sent that to you, shocked me that when you see the two groups the same, you look at that group, their children's development and cognitive development, everything is worse than pre-pandemic levels, which show it's not just the virus itself, it's the things we've all endured. And some people that are underserviced with food insecurity in other parts of the world have endured even more. So the stress that has effects on immune function, but also the poor diet, the changing effects, all these things all the speakers are going to talk about how this interacts to affect child development. And also briefly, the long haul COVIDs, some people get better and some don't. And part of the aspects are genetics that Ahmed, I'm sure he'll talk about as well, but some of the other works, these folks that have deranged microbiomes, studies out of Hong Kong have found those are the ones that get long-term COVID with cognitive impairment, nerve damage, gut dysfunction. And again, we're finding that either the virus itself or the antibiotics that are used prophylactically are affecting mitochondrial function. So the idea that there are real mechanisms for mental health and also how stress, emotional stress affects microbiome, it's tragic at the start, but it has tremendous benefits to understand very novel ways. And the center is real food and nutrition, kind of nursing that microbiome along. That's going to be a big part of getting us through this.
Yeah, thank you. Ahmed, I'll turn it over to you on that question. Any lines of inquiry that you've been following with regard to COVID or mental health areas of research that you're focused on?
Yeah, I mean, those are all excellent points that Derrick raises. I mean, it's tough to really overstate the enormity of the impact of the pandemic, and we're still not through it, right? We're constantly battling new waves with new variants, and that in and of itself, I think, is continuing to cause stress for many people. And so we know that some of the reports that have come out over the past year or so have shown the changes, the lifestyle changes of some people during the pandemic. With the increased stress, there has been a decrease in physical activity, worsening in the quality of people's diets, greater consumption of alcohol and illicit drugs, and that, of course, is just exacerbating the state of mental health. Reports out of the UK, I recall, showing from 2019 to 2020, more than a doubling of cases of depression. And in the United States, anxiety and depression have more than quadrupled. So it was already bad because the statistics were already quite high. So you can imagine just the increase in the prevalence of that and the impact that has on people's livelihoods. Coupled with, as Derrick mentioned, with inflation, food insecurity is just making matters worse. So people are finding it quite challenging to afford, nutritious and healthy food. So these are, broader issues that, as societies and governments, need to consider how to cope and how to help people get through this, because, we know there is going to be a light at the end of this tunnel. And it's a matter of doing what we can to to build resilience and to help people cope with these daily challenges.
And if I could interject just briefly, further to what Ahmed said, there's things we've seen in the past, and of all things, dealing with underserviced populations that have poor nutrition. There are prison studies we've talked about in Europe and Holland and Britain, where people in prison with severe neuropsychiatric conditions, not petty crimes. We're talking about very difficult, simple things even before we understood this stuff. Changing the diet reduced violence and antisocial behavior by 30%. And some of the things I've talked about, we'll get more technical on it. These compounds, when they sort of get deranged by gut microbiome, cause obsessional behavior, lack of social interaction, fixation on objects, anxiety, impulse control. That can model autism, but it can also model a lot of what we see as they're rare, but these senseless acts of things showing violence, lack of empathy, or rigid ways of looking at things. They're rare, but they cause tremendous fear in societies. So I really urge this meeting is going to be a way that we can branch out to all these underserviced areas, but also learn from our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world where we see very potential focused areas that something as simple as local food production, vegetables, high fiber the last thing we would ever think 20 years ago is this could affect mental health. And that's the next generation who's going to look after us. And I'm longer in the tooth than the rest of you. So that's going to be important to me too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up some really important points. And even one of them just before this meeting, I was reading my email, and one of the trends for 2022 is that food as medicine is going local. So you mentioned just tapping into local food resources. I think when it comes to food insecurity, that's another area where, we have really large social nets that don't necessarily do a lot for people in their local communities. And that's something that we really want to highlight as well at this year's meeting, is that there are a variety of ways. There's a role for each person in the nutrition ecosystem, for each field, for each area of expertise to contribute. When we especially talk about those vulnerable populations, whether it's pregnant women or children or the elderly or those who are houseless or imprisoned. There's military, exactly. There's so many vulnerable groups that need the specific interventions of the people in their communities and the resources that can be offered. So we're really excited to be able to offer a much more diverse panoply of expertise this year. And I think let's shift over then to talk a little bit about the summit itself. We obviously have worked together closely on crafting this year's Science and Practice Conference. And I just wanted to sort of open up a conversation about what you're excited about, either the way that we've crafted the summit, which will be hybrid, by the way, both in person in San Diego and online as well for those who prefer to attend online. Are there any speakers or topics that you're excited to hear about or be in conversation with? And let's start with Ahmed this time.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, just the hybrid nature of it, I think, is quite interesting. Obviously, people still want to get together, and there are a few substitutes for that face-to-face interaction. But for various reasons, there are some that still won't be able to attend or choose not to attend in person, but this gives them an opportunity to still be part of that. And what I love most about the program really is that, virtually every session has that strong emphasis on personalization for the individual. Because again, I think that cuts across all subjects and topics. So really excited for it.
Yeah, I am really excited and forward to. As you know, I've been with you guys probably about 8 or 9 years. And when we started, the only time psychiatrists, neurologists, nutritionists, and microbiologists would talk would be like on the golf course. It was so far removed from this. But the technology, this is the good news. I don't think people just didn't know. The technology, the ability with omics, metabolomics, genomics, looking at bugs, different modeling systems, enables these diverse groups to talk together and say, there's a real mechanism for this. This isn't an alternative reality. And we also caution each other on overshooting. This has gained a lot of interest, but still has to be cautiously done. But I'm very excited with the long-term groups. But some of these young comers that are coming in, really interesting. Because when we're talking about real food, I'm thinking of Selena Ahmed at Montana State. So she's been all around the world in all these different groups with early, archaic farming, tea, which is not just food, it's antioxidants that she'll go in later. But be able to see the capacity of, sustainable food that isn't from another planet. People need to eat, and it may be that we share these things across. I mentioned before that the best friends we're going to have are probably in agriculture, to know that there's sustainable agriculture. Some can be mass produced, but we also need those veggies in there. So these kind of groups, I'm very hopeful for the future. I really commend you, Victoria and Ahmed, for letting me work with you to set this up. I'm honored.
Oh, we're honored. It's such a pleasure to work with both of you this closely. And I think, Selena's work is so interesting, and she's working really closely with Indigenous populations. And I think there's sort of a big Indigenous food movement right now that we can all learn from, especially in light of our ultra processed world. But I do also want to highlight, Ahmed, that you wanted to talk about one of the speakers that you're excited about too.
Yeah, again, just love the program from beginning to end. But, if I had to pick one, I know there's a talk by Professor Yani Maromatus from St. Mary's University. He's been doing some interesting work on genetic information and nutrition knowledge. So really looking forward to see what the latest research coming out of his lab is going to be.
Yeah, thank you. And I should also mention that the week after our summit, the ANA is going to be partnering with the American Psychological Association on a 3-part webinar series. So we're also really excited. Derrick, you mentioned earlier, nutritionists and psychiatrists, psychologists, and others maybe not being in conversation so much in the past. And we're really thrilled to be able to have those conversations in a big way with the American Psychological Association. So we have lots of great programming coming up this year. And just to wrap up, are there any, could you give us each just a sneak peek of something that you'll be talking about at the summit in the fall? And then maybe one kind of go-to fun mental health and personalized nutrition tip for our viewers before we wrap up. Derrick, go ahead.
Okay. I've given a number of talks in the past, you can see, in terms of our role of gut microbiome and development. So I'll be doing a bit of a survey of how advanced we are in terms of understanding the real mechanisms of how gut bacteria can modulate brain function and behavior. So the high points are going to be synapse formation, learning, memory, glia, physiology, keeping neurons happy and working well, microglia activations, lipids, mitochondria, the certain genetic groups, and how the derangements of the microbiome, for whatever reason, antibiotics, birth practices, food, affect that. My take-home message as well, and website can show a lot more detail on that. But again, we worked on short-chain fatty acids, but there's a whole slew of other things that are coming through. There's a whole language down there. If I could take my take-home little gem, it's the biggest thing that people that have these problems, we're going to be dealing with, tailored and personalized diets, but it's the fact that the Western diet, no disrespect, is so terrible in terms of high sugar, high preservatives, which as a caveat are one of the propionic acid I work with. It's one of the things these bacteria produce. And it's not that it's evil, it's getting too much of it too soon. How that kind of a high preservative diet, high sugar, and more importantly, low inulin containing vegetables. That's bug food that tends to make butyrate that's better. How that diet, and I'm being broad, is making us anxious, obsessional, early on having in some subgroups autism and developmental conditions, but anxiety, OCD, problems with metabolic syndrome, and later studies too. The downside is the Parkinson's and Alzheimer picture. So that's the kind of the take-home message. I'm really a fan of not being oversimplistic, mostly vegetables, lean meats, some supplementation with omega-3, and also carnitine. There's a long spiel on how this gets damaged by the microbiome, the system gets affected, and the idea of real exercise, which, believe it or not, also affects microbiome.
Yeah, thank you. Ahmed, how about you? Just a sneak peek and a tip for our viewers.
Sure. Well, as you know, last year I gave a talk on nutrition, genetics, and premenstrual symptoms. And so one of my PhD students, Tara Zaytoun, has been working in this area as part of her doctoral thesis. And over the past few months since the last presentation, she's made a number of other interesting observations with other micronutrients. So I plan to give an update on the status of those research findings and where we are. And in terms of take home, I mean, I think, Derrick just finished off with talking about exercise, and I think that is very important. And I'd say, just get moving. See, I have a stationary bike over there, and I'm probably going to hop on it after this call. I find even just, 15, 20 minutes of a good pace just clears the mind. And that's really important. And in terms of, from a nutrition perspective, more recently, I've been trying to explore different plants, different vegetables in particular, going through the supermarket and just looking at something that I've never bought before and just increasing, one's repertoire of plant-based foods, because as Derrick mentioned, there are so many different types of microbes that feed on very different plants and the different substances in plants. And by increasing the diversity of the plants that you're consuming, that will also increase the diversity of your microbiome. And we know that has all kinds of beneficial effects.
And yet, just going back in the day, the microbiome was sort of, they were there for the ride and eat bran. And and just as Ahmed said, the different kinds of these non-digestible fibers, inulins and other things, what's in bran is completely different from bananas, from your good stuff, your avocado, your onions, your asparagus. It's just not all the same. And the biggest thing is it loves diversity. And this is how we feel the microbiome and immune system and brain work. An immune system is a fluid nervous system. It pays attention to something, it deals with it, it handles something later, and it maintains vegetative functions. So does the nervous system. And you derange that, what do you have? You have we're not boosting immune system. You have a dysregulated immune system that reacts when it shouldn't, or can't handle something when something occurs, like COVID. But it's also the exact same parallels in the nervous system, finding importance to something that isn't, right? Having obsession, anxiety, a heightened response, or cognitive impairment. You have diseases where you can't remember. And also, I'll show in some of my work, you have diseases where you can't forget. The synapse is on the whole time. So that's obsession, autism, post-traumatic stress. So the idea that nutrition could fix this, remember that statistic I said, a 30% reduction in serious violent behavior in huge major studies predated the microbiome in severe convicts. Now, what could that be applied for general populations when we all watch the news and go, why would someone do this? I think this talk will show why these behaviors are occurring and what can be done to prevent it.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I hope that everyone watching is excited to attend the summit and your lectures in particular. Thank you both so much for spending this part of your afternoon with me. For all of our viewers, we hope you'll join us at Personalized Nutrition 2022 in San Diego or online. We have a variety of scientific talks as well as a clinical track. So for those clinicians who are really interested in digging in and learning more about specific case studies around mental health and nutrition, we'll have that for you. We're really excited about that programming this year. And you can visit us at theana.org and register for the summit at theana.org/personalized nutrition summit. Ahmed, Derrick, thank you so much.
My pleasure as always, Victoria.
Thanks, Victoria. Great chatting with you. Great chatting with you, Derrick.